In the Middle Ages, a woman's social role and status were not measured by age, but by her sexual experience. In the traditional view of medieval society, women were categorized into three groups: virgins with no sexual experience, married wives actively engaged in sexual life, and widows whose sexual activity had ceased. A woman's rights and responsibilities depended on which of these three categories she belonged to. Besides these, there were also mistresses and prostitutes, two groups that operated outside the moral boundaries of mainstream society and were not accepted by prevailing values. Medieval marriage customs have had a profound impact on future generations, and many symbolic rituals are still in use today, essentially serving as the prototypes for modern Western weddings. Therefore, exploring the marriage and sexual customs of medieval women is a fascinating subject. Engagement practices in the Middle Ages were quite distinct between the nobility and common folk. Legally, the marriageable age was set at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but engagements could be arranged as early as age 7. Noble families often arranged marriages for their children at a young age based on political needs, and it was common for many couples to meet for the first time only on their wedding day after being engaged for many years. For the peasant class, the approach was much less formal and more pragmatic. Once engaged, it was common for couples to start living together and even have children. These children would be officially recognized as legitimate heirs after the wedding ceremony. Besides the ceremonial exchange of wedding rings, the signing of a marriage contract was crucial during engagements. The contract was established primarily to clarify the property rights of both spouses after marriage, with a particular focus on the bride's dowry, including the management and inheritance of the dowry after her death. Fundamentally, marriage was considered a property relationship. For the wealthy, dowries typically consisted of money and land. For commoners, dowries included household utensils, tools, furniture, clothing, and livestock. Typically, if the husband died or the marriage was annulled, the dowry would be returned to the wife. If the wife passed away, the dowry would generally be left to her sons. If a widow remarried, the dowry was supposed to be returned to the relatives of her former husband. Despite the Catholic Church's marriage laws explicitly stating that marriage must be based on the mutual consent of both man and woman, in reality, under the feudal patriarchal society, marriages were often entirely arranged by parents. Of course, if parents passed away after their children were betrothed, but before the marriage, the children could opt to break the engagement by buying out the contract. However, this was particularly difficult for women who had no income of their own and depended solely on their inheritance. In 1207, the amount required could be as high as £20 or more, which was an astronomical sum for ordinary people and could necessitate the selling of family assets even for noble women. Some women were fortunate enough to become wealthy family heiresses, but they too could not escape male guardianship. Many noble women had the king as their guardian, meaning the king had the authority to arrange marriages for them as he saw fit. According to the law, if a female heiress married against her guardian's wishes, she would immediately lose her right to inherit property. In contrast to the nobility who considered family background, peasant-class marriages mainly focused on physical health, whether the man could shoulder the family responsibilities and whether the woman could bear children. However, since many peasants during the Middle Ages were serfs and not free in person, they could only choose spouses within the boundaries of their lord's land. Both partners had to have the same lord, and they needed the lord's consent to marry. Otherwise, they could be fined. Before the wedding, the bride was required to undergo a virginity check, although this was waived for those who were already cohabiting or had children before marriage. Weddings were commonly held in churches, and the scale of the ceremony depended entirely on the financial capabilities of the two families involved. Typically, only wealthy families could afford to carry out all the traditional procedures. On the wedding day, minstrels accompanied the bride and groom and their entourages as they paraded through the town to the church. The position in the procession was determined by the status of each family, with the higher status family leading the way. At the church entrance, the priest would ask the couple a series of questions, whether they had reached the legal age for marriage, whether both parties agreed to the marriage and had obtained their parents' consent, and whether they were related by blood, and if there were any church dispensations, etc. Afterward, the dowry would be loudly announced, and upon completion, the groom would give the bride a small bag of money as a token of his willingness to let his wife manage the household finances. The bride, in turn, would distribute this money to the onlookers, particularly the poor, to bring good fortune. Following this, under the priest's observation, the couple would exchange wedding vows, and the groom would place the ring on the bride's finger. Once these ceremonies were completed, everyone would enter the church for prayers and mass. If the couple already had children from their engagement, these children would be declared legitimate heirs. After the wedding ceremony, the wedding feast commenced, an occasion for the wealthy to lavish their resources. According to records, the wealthy Italian merchant Francesco Dattini married Margherita during the carnival week. The feast included 406 loaves of bread, 250 eggs, 100 pounds of cheese, 4 slaughtered cows, 16 sheep, 37 capons, 11 hens, 2 wild boars, as well as some pigeons and fish. The drinks included local wines and Chianti imported from Tuscany. The bride and groom were expected to prepare at least 3 gifts. The bride brought a dowry for the groom's family. The groom prepared a wedding gift for the bride as compensation for her virginity, and the couple had to prepare gifts for the priest and the guests on the wedding day. Of course, for the humble common folk, if a very poor couple were getting married, the guests would not only bring their own food, but also help build a house for the newlyweds as much as they could. Everyone who could afford to contribute money did so, and those who could offer labor did that, treating the wedding like a community festival. After the wedding, one of the most crucial matters between spouses is undoubtedly sex. In the eyes of modern people, ancient individuals might be perceived as reticent about discussing sex, but in reality, sexual relations played a significant role in medieval marital relationships. If a husband was impotent and unable to fulfill marital sexual duties, the wife could petition the church for a divorce. This was almost the only legitimate reason for a divorce that medieval women could invoke. Regarding the topic of sex, the church had a lot to say. Christianity greatly influenced secular life in the Middle Ages, with the church not only serving as a religious institution, but also profoundly guiding the everyday lives of the medieval populace. Canon law was directly applied as the fundamental law of marriage. Christianity viewed all women as descendants of Eve from the Garden of Eden, and some priests claimed that women were baits sent by Satan to tempt men. The church believed that the purpose of marital life was to reproduce offspring, not to indulge in the pleasures of sex. To prevent couples from being consumed by sexual activities, the church designated many days when sexual relations were prohibited. These included 60 church holidays, Easter week, Holy Week, Pentecost week, plus the wife's menstrual period. Counting on fingers, it turns out that for over half the year, couples were not supposed to engage in sexual relations. If a woman did engage in forbidden acts, she could confess to a priest. In the 11th century, confessional handbooks recorded questions that priests frequently asked, such as, "Did you make an object in the shape of a penis and place it in your private parts? Did you sleep with a woman while your husband was away? Did you use swallowing semen as a method to enhance your husband's sexual desire? Did you intentionally add your menstrual blood to your husband's food to arouse his passion?" It can be said that medieval women were more open in their practices than people might assume. Sex is considered an important criterion for measuring whether marital life is harmonious. In the Middle Ages, it was believed that regular sexual activity was beneficial for maintaining a woman's physical and mental health. If a husband was impotent, it was seen as harmful to his wife's health, as she could become hysterical, suffer convulsions, or even experience epileptic fits due to sexual frustration. Wives had the right to divorce husbands who were sexually incapable. In medieval divorce cases, insufficient sexual performance by the husband was a widely used basis for claims, so much so that in places like England and France, there were public trials. These trials, conducted by panels composed of church and government officials, involved publicly testing the husband's sexual capabilities. The husband had to demonstrate the complete process of achieving an erection, penetration, and ejaculation while being observed. If he failed to do so, he would be judged as having lost the case. Public trials in France concerning a husband's sexual performance continued until they were abolished in the 17th century. In England, there was a recorded instance involving a Thomas of Chobham who devised a method to determine if a husband was absolutely impotent. This method began with a group of wise women conducting a physical examination of the man's genitals, followed by a bedroom test. After a meal, the man and a woman were placed in a bed together, while the wise women stayed nearby for several nights. If it was found that the man's genitals were completely non-functional, the couple would be separated. One can only imagine the pressure on the man, trying to perform under the watchful eyes of a group of women, and how likely it was for him to function normally under such circumstances. In the Middle Ages, the primary purpose of sexual activity was to produce offspring, which was crucial for medieval families. Women were expected to bear an heir for their husband's family. There were many recommendations on the best timing for intercourse to produce a male heir, as well as numerous recipes and herbal remedies guaranteed to ensure pregnancy. For instance, the 14th century book Taquinum Sanitatis offered herbal treatments that claimed to almost guarantee the gender of the baby. Since abortion was considered a grievous sin, medieval women also actively sought various peculiar methods of contraception. Some used blocks of honey for physical obstruction, others applied plasters to their husband's testicles, and some consumed various bizarre herbs. Of course, modern science has proven these contraceptive methods to be ineffective. The Church severely condemned extramarital sexual activities for both men and women, yet it did not condemn men for soliciting prostitutes. Regardless of the reasons the Church provided to justify this stance, the underlying principle was straightforward. Providing an outlet for men with excessive sexual desires was considered necessary to maintain social stability. Prostitutes were publicly scorned in the Middle Ages, but in reality, the Church often turned a blind eye to the operation of brothels. Some church leaders would preach morality and ethics by day, and not only patronize prostitutes by night, but also invest in brothels to collect rent. By the late Middle Ages, the management of brothels had been formalized into official regulations specifying working hours and compensation for prostitutes. There are records, such as a case in Paris, where a prostitute was sued for spinning wool in her spare time, accused of holding a side job during her designated work hours. Prostitutes had a very low social status and bore the brunt of societal contempt. In many regions, prostitutes were required to wear distinct marks on their clothing when they went outside to indicate their profession.